Vitali. Senator Fawcett.
Deputy President, I rise to address this issue in two ways. One is around the principle of whether the Parliament or the Executive should be approving the deployment of our forces, and I note that the Democrats and the Greens, and then the Greens again, and I think now the Greens for the third time, have put bills into this place dealing with this issue, and in fact it has been the subject of a Senate inquiry in the past. And the second part I'll deal with is the topic of Syria itself and Australia's decision to extend our current operations from the Iraq area of operation across the border into eastern Syria. I have spoken in this place before in response to the Greens' contention that the Parliament should be the one who authorises forces to serve outside the territorial limits of Australia. And the bill they put up previously highlighted or proposed that the ADF not be permitted to serve outside the territorial limits of Australia except in accordance with a resolution agreed to by each House of the Parliament or in accordance with a number of specific circumstances. And they went through a number of those circumstances, but also contained some provisions for emergency situations where the Governor-General can proclaim that an emergency exists that may require ADF service. Well, as I say, that concept has been put forward before on a number of occasions, and when the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Legislation Committee examined the bill put forward by the Democrats when Senator Faulkner was the Minister for Defence, they looked at it and came up with a number of concerns as to the practicality of that occurring. And I would encourage people who have an interest in this matter to go and read that report, because it was a comprehensive report and had issues such as, for example, the decisions that are made by the Executive use classified and sensitive intelligence, and the disclosure of that intelligence, as they say, and I quote, may well compromise an operation and the safety of Australian forces or their allies. They go on to say, and I quote, if we protect that information to protect our forces or our allies, then if the information were necessarily held from the Parliament, then those required under the proposed legislation to make critical decisions about the deployment of forces would not be fully informed, an equally concerning situation for the security of the nation and its forces. Two very simple and easy to understand concerns with this issue, and I say that as someone who is privileged to serve at the moment on the Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee, where we do get access to a range of information from the various security agencies, and as we come into the public inquiries and debates in this place, it is difficult often to be able to convey a sense of why and the importance of certain actions without being able to speak freely about that information. And that's why the Parliament does put in place smaller groups who are cleared to have access to that information so that they can make a decision, an informed decision, on the behalf of the Parliament, who are the representatives of the people of Australia. And we've just seen recently that Intelligence and Security Committee fulfilling that function quite effectively with the Citizenship Bill, so that we achieve a balance between the national security requirement to give agencies the powers they need, but balancing those laws with the things that characterise Australia of being an open, fair society where individual liberties are respected. We'll step up a scale, and it's that same principle that is employed by having the National Security Committee of Cabinet. So the Executive are the ones who, under our Constitution, provide the advice to the Governor-General around the passage of legislation, but they also make executive decisions around the deployment of Australian forces. And it's the same reason that that group, the National Security Committee of Cabinet, can receive detailed, informed briefings of sensitive and classified information which will give them the context and the understanding of the consequences of action, but equally the consequences of inaction. They also understand the cost-benefit in terms of global outcomes, national outcomes, the expenditure of revenue associated with each of those actions. And many of those things can't be discussed in a public space. And so that's why that system is set up, and it works well. And so that's why there is no requirement in the Constitution or the defence legislation for parliamentary involvement in most acts of declaring war or deploying troops. And I quote here that the power to make war, to deploy troops and declare peace are now part of the executive power of the Commonwealth exercised by the Governor-General on the advice of the Federal Executive Council or responsible ministers. Contemporary practice, however, is that decisions to go to war or deploy troops are matters for the Prime Minister and Cabinet and do not involve the Governor-General or the Federal Executive Council. Since the establishment of the National Security Committee of Cabinet in 1996, this body is the primary body that has access to all the classified information and briefs from departments. They then made the decision on behalf of the government. So, that's the Australian system. We've heard discussion today and in previous debates pointing to other peer nations and claiming that their parliaments provide this function. Well, can I go to a few of our key peers? The Canadians, for example, under Canadian constitutional law, and I quote, "The federal cabinet can, without parliamentary approval or consultation, commit Canadian forces to action abroad, whether in the form of a specific current operation or possible future contingencies resulting from international treaty obligations. Under the Canadian Constitution Act of 1867, sections 15 and 19, command of the armed forces is vested in the Queen and exercised in her name by the federal cabinet acting under the leadership of the Prime Minister." So Canada still has the same executive power that is exercised here in Australia. Let's take New Zealand. The formal right to declare war was clearly part of the royal prerogative inherited from Great Britain in 1840, and it remains an acknowledged part of New Zealand law. Defence and wartime prerogatives include the right to declare war and peace and the deployment and armament of defence forces. The royal prerogative is primarily exercised by the Governor-General on the advice of elected ministers or executive by authority of the letters patent constituting the office of the Governor-General of New Zealand, 1983. Let's go to let's go to the UK, a case which has frequently been quoted recently. The deployment of troops and the issuing of orders to engage in hostilities are matters of royal prerogative exercisable by ministers. The government has liberty of action in this field, and the Parliament need not give its approval. Since 2003, there have been calls for aspects of the royal prerogative, including the monarch's war powers, to be codified or subject to parliamentary scrutiny. Indeed, a draft bill to modify the UK legislation is before the House of Lords, but it's far narrower than the legislation which has been presented on several occasions in this place. And it applies only to decisions by the government to authorise the use of force by UK forces if that is both outside of the UK and regulated by the laws of armed conflict. But at this stage, it is still only a draft before the House of Lords. The decision of Prime Minister Cameron to seek in principle support from the House of Commons in 2013 was a decision he made and accepted, but he used his discretion to do that. The UK government is not bound to do that by their law. In the United States, the Constitution, under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, grants to Congress the power to declare war, to raise and support armies, and to provide and maintain a navy. While the President is made the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces under Article 2, Section 2 and Clause 1, the specific power to deploy US Armed Forces is covered by the War Powers Resolution of 1973, also known as the War Powers Act. And that resolution imposes on the President the following, and I quote, "The President, in every possible instance, shall consult with Congress before introducing United States Armed Forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances." Well, like a lot of areas of politics, these things are not interpretations, are not necessarily agreed, because every possible circumstance or instance and consult are not defined by the resolution and have been interpreted in different ways at different times by different parties. Notably, the term consult does not equate to the approval of Congress, a matter that is contemplated by what is being put before the Senate today. Many US presidents have claimed that the War Powers Resolution is an unconstitutional infringement on their authority as the Commander-in-Chief and have refused to be bound by it. The US courts, likewise, have been reluctant to accept jurisdiction in matters seeking to enforce the resolution, asserting it's a political rather than a judicial matter. In one case in 2003, a judge of the District Court rejected the contention that the President must have congressional authority to order American forces into combat, saying that case law makes it clear that the Congress does not have exclusive rights to determine whether or not the United States engages in war. So, Mr. Acting Deputy President, I think it's fairly clear that Australia has a system that is not unlike most of our peers, Canada, UK, US, New Zealand, whereby the executive, for very practical reasons, has the authority to make informed and timely decisions. So can I come now to the topic of Syria? The discussion that's occurred in the last few days in terms of Australia's commitment to extend our air operations into Syria would almost have you believe that we had decided to redeploy the AIF and invade the Middle East. In practical terms, as the CDF mentioned during the media conference the other day, the difference this makes is that the sorties that go into Iraq will either divert about 10 degrees left of track or go 50 or 100 miles further north of the current area of operation. If you look at the map, you will see that the eastern part of Syria comes across the northern part of Iraq, and the practicalities on the ground are that Daesh know that our rules of engagement are tight because we have a policy of not inflicting civilian casualties, and so they know that they can avoid the containing air power of the Allies in two ways. One is by embedding their fighters amongst civilians, and we've seen that before in Gaza, and we see the horrific consequences for civilians where people commit horrific war crimes by doing that. And they also know that under the current rules of engagement, if they withdraw across the border, and bear in mind we are talking a desert now where in practical terms the border does not exist, but if they withdraw across that, like crossing the chamber here, then they know that a certain number of participants in the Allied action cannot prosecute the action against them. And so what this means is that if you are notified of a target, and by the time you actually get your asset in place, that target has driven 100 yards further on, you cannot legally attack it. What this does is it means we no longer give people who have been wreaking havoc in Iraq the option of seeking refuge by driving 200 yards across a border. Okay? It is not a significant big force going to invade Syria. We're talking about a very pragmatic extension of the area of operations to avoid the situation where forces who have been either conducting combat operations or providing logistic support within Iraq can seek refuge by just crossing a border, wait for the aircraft to leave, come back and do it all again. I do not see in any way that that can be criticised in that it is a very common sense extension of the rules of engagement of our forces there so that they can effectively reduce or hopefully destroy the military capability of Daesh. The fact that we are doing this is legal. That was covered off today by the Attorney-General under the principles of collective self-defence and the 4 requirements that are laid out under international law, and all 4 of those requirements are met in this case. So it is legal, it is practical in terms of avoiding people seeking refuge, and it doesn't expose our forces to any greater danger in that kind of operation just into eastern Syria than their current operations do. Obviously, if they were to go deep into Syria, where Assad's forces are, where potentially Russian forces may be moving in, that would be a different scenario, but that is not what is being proposed. And I think it's important that people realise the limitation that has been placed on the area of operation that is being considered or has been decided on in this case. The last part I want to talk about is principle. I actually agree, and Senator Di Natale might be surprised by this, but I agree with him. The long-term solution here isn't just about Daesh, it's about all the forces that are acting in that region, the Assad forces, the regime, the Sunni majority, the plethora of opposition groups, the external actors who are taking a part in that. But can I say, no amount of talk here, no amount of goodwill here is necessarily going to bring those parties to the table immediately. Hopefully it will happen one day, probably with the exception of Daesh, who I don't believe are actually inclined to negotiate with anyone, but it doesn't happen overnight. The Greens mentioned the treaty with Iran and said out of the blue it occurred. Well, hardly out of the blue. A lot of nations working at that for a long period of time with many extensions before that finally occurred. So the question practically is, if we strive for that goal, and I agree, I don't see that we are militarily going to be able to impose a solution that has a solution to a problem that has been inherent in this part of the world for centuries. But if it's going to take a period of time, just as we look back now at situations like Rwanda and the genocide that occurred there, and there is a collective guilt in the United Nations, recognised by Mr Ban when he spoke at the 20th anniversary, that the UN could have and should have done more to prevent that genocide, we cannot wait for, a month, a year, 5 years? How long will it take before those parties, if they've had these tensions for centuries, how long will it take till they come together? And therefore, just as we look back and say, why didn't we do more in Rwanda? Well, what we are doing here is saying, as a minimum, we will not give Daesh the freedom to roam at will and form into large groups to conduct major military operations. Now, clearly, they are still there, they are still active, they embed themselves with the civilian population, but what we have managed to do is to degrade their capabilities and particularly to degrade their ability to form large military-like organisations to use indirect firepower indiscriminately by having air power that every time we see a recognisable target, we've been able to interdict and destroy that target. So the mission here is about saying what can we do at reasonable risk to degrade Daesh while the very things that Senator Di Natale talked about are occurring. How do we stop the flow of oil and arms across the Turkish border? How do we stop the recruitment of foreign fighters? The Committee Intelligence and Security visit that I talked about earlier across to the US, UK and France, dealing with this whole topic, highlighted that one of the key things that attracts Australians and Americans and Europeans of the Muslim faith to go over there to fight is the very existence of the Islamic State. It's seen as fulfilling a destiny. And so one of the ways to actually degrade Daesh is stopping oil, is stopping flow of arms, but also to stop the flow of fighters. And so clearly, the more we can degrade their military capability, degrade their presence on the ground, we start creating an environment where perhaps those other parties can negotiate the peace. But it's important to understand in the context of this motion that's been put forward by the Greens that, for very good reason, it is the executive and not the parliament, not only here but in our allies, who make these decisions, and the decision to go into Syria is not a huge step from where we have been, and it is occurring for very good and practical reasons, and our whole presence there is not just mindlessly lobbing bombs in, it is to say what reasonable steps can we take to prevent genocide and the freedom of action of a particularly nasty force that this world will be well served to see the back of. I will not be supporting this motion.